Judges. In the book of Judges, chapter 2 is where we'll begin. The theme of Judges, honestly, is found a couple of times, once in 17 verse 6, but it's most potently found at the very, very end of the book in chapter 21, verse 25. So if you got your thumb in chapter 2, go ahead and flip over to chapter 21 really quick. Today's message is titled, Our Time of Judges. In verse 25 of chapter 1, you read, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes." That is quite the situation we find ourselves in. And I would say it's kind of a pit of our own digging. What would you say in modern culture modern American culture is the primary value that we put above all other things? Would you say it is freedom, liberty? I would say that's probably the primary American value. You see the American flag and you think freedom. It represents freedom. And it's true. Freedom, liberty, those are extremely important American values. But is freedom and liberty, is that to the expense or at the expense? Is that value prized at the expense of other values, such as righteousness, such as worshiping God? Oftentimes in today's world, it is. And this has been for quite some time, we have been separating freedom, we have been separating liberty from moral responsibility. And this is leading us to some very terrible places, which we are experiencing very much. It's been getting worse and worse and worse over the last several decades. Some people want to pinpoint the 60s as when it started going downhill. Some people want to pinpoint the 1920s as when it started going downhill. Some people want to pinpoint, some people want to go even earlier. I'm not quite sure of times when people wanted to go earlier. If you want to go even earlier than America, you can go back to Europe. You can think of the Protestant Reformation, where that kind of kickstarted. So the Reformation and also the Enlightenment, that kind of kickstarted the idea of liberty, individual liberty above moral responsibility to God. And that kind of mindset has been moving further and further. It's been getting worse for hundreds of years. But it kind of found its resting place in America with its founding in liberty. 1776, we think of the flag, we think of freedom. That's just the cultural keystone of our country. Freedom, even at the expense of moral responsibility. And more, it's been slowly moving that way for hundreds of years, but it seems to be accelerating more and more in the last few decades. So what does that look like in history? Is our situation unique, where we replace God with individual liberty? I would say no, that is not unique. And in fact, in our text today, in Judges, we will find this mindset, every man doing that which is right in his own eyes, as a very ancient problem. That is individual liberty at the cost of moral responsibility, primarily to God, but also to your people, your country, your kinsfolk, your family, all of that together. We are not individuals per se. Yes, we are individuals, but we're not only individuals. We are also a community. We also live in families, in villages, in towns, communities based not only on geography, but also communities based on common interests, communities based on small geography, that would be towns, cities, then also larger geographies and cultures. This would be nation, this would be state, country, all of those things. So we are social creatures. We are not only individuals, we are social creatures, and our responsibility is not only to ourselves, but it is to God first and foremost, and then to our community, to others. We think of, I remember growing up with the acronym JOY, Jesus, others, you, and that speaks some kind of truth. God is first, love your neighbor as yourself. The assumption there is you do love yourself, but the command then is, all right, we assume you love yourself. Now, the love you have for yourself, apply that to others. Think of others more than yourself, because we know you treat yourself well. So we know you love yourself. So I don't need to command you to love yourself, but as much as you love yourself, love others, but love God first and foremost. And that is the first commandment with promise. So God is our primary responsibility. Others is our secondary responsibility, and ourselves, it's not necessarily a responsibility because the assumption is already there that you do love yourself. Now, if you are in kind of a depressive state and you hate yourself, then there is some counseling needing to be done there. But that's not universal. That is kind of an exceptional case where someone needs to be taught how to love themselves in a proper way. So in this, our time of Judges, are we experiencing a time of Judges? That might be a better question. Are we experiencing a time of Judges? What is the time of Judges, though? Well, if we go back to our second chapter of Judges. So at the very end, it stated the theme. Judges chapter 1, verse 25 says, in those days there was no king in Israel. And that was the situation. There was no king. There was no consistent ruler. There was no monarchy where you had a ruler who passed on the governorship to his son. There was no consistent monarchy. That's what king means here. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So now we go back to Judges chapter 2. Chapter 1 kind of breaks down the appropriation. No, that's not the word. The taking over of various regions. And in the entire book of Joshua, you had Joshua, the children of Israel, entering into the promised land, conquering the Canaanites, driving them out, whether killing them or driving them out, they were conquering Canaan. And then Judges chapter 1 summarizes which Canaanites they were not able to drive out. And as a result, those Canaanites, whether the Jebusites, the Hivites, all the other ites, those Canaanites that Israel was not able to drive out would be a thorn in their flesh, would be a thorn in their side from that point on. So that's chapter 1. It summarizes which inhabitants the children of Israel were not able to drive out. And as a result, those were going to be a problem for them from then on. So chapter 2, verses 1 up to like 5 says, here's the consequence of not driving out those inhabitants. And then verse 6 and a few verses afterwards speak of how Joshua ended his life. He died at 110 years old. They buried him. And then in verse 10, this is where we're going to jump into our lesson today. Verse 10, and also all that generation. And what is that generation? Well, if we go back to the book of Numbers, we know that the generation that came out of Egypt, they came up to the promised land and had the opportunity to go in, but they refused. And as a result of their refusal, God condemned that generation to wander in the wilderness for 40 years so that generation would die off. And then the next generation which would be brought up would then go into the promised land. And so in our Wednesday night studies, we're studying through the book of Numbers right now, and I think we're about halfway through, and then we're going to go on to Deuteronomy after that. So that generation that was wandering in the wilderness, they died off, and then the next one, they rose up, and that generation is the one with Joshua, who went into the promised land, and they conquered it. Now, this generation that conquered Canaan, conquered the promised land, and dwelt in it, they failed to drive out some of the inhabitants, and that was going to be a problem for generations to come. But that generation right there is the one that's being spoken of right here. All that generation were gathered unto their fathers, and there arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. Now, does the word know in this case mean have a historical knowledge of? I don't think so. This is one generation removed. They were children at the time that the conquering of Canaan happened. So I don't think this word is referring to a historical knowledge. And in fact, throughout Scripture, when you see the word know, you can tell in context it is speaking more of a personal internalization of the idea, not just a historical knowledge, but an internalization of it. You think of the Pharaoh in the book of Exodus that rose up after Ramses and after Joseph, and it speaks of that Pharaoh as not knowing Joseph. Do you think that Pharaoh was ignorant of who Joseph was and what he did? I don't think so. I think he simply did not care who Joseph was and wanted to enslave the Israelites, enslave the Hebrews, rather than treat them the same way that his Pharaoh forefathers, his Pharaoh predecessors had treated the Hebrews. He didn't care about that. He knew about it, but he didn't care about it. And that intimate internalization, I think, is generally what the Bible refers to when it uses the word know. In fact, going further with that idea of intimacy, the word know is used as a euphemism for a husband and wife marital relationship. You think of Adam and Eve. Adam knew his wife. So that word know in the Bible is much more involved. It's much more internalized. It's much more intimate than simply having a head knowledge of a historical fact. So you have here this generation. There arose another generation after them, which knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. So they had a historical knowledge of it, or at least I believe they had a historical knowledge of it, but they didn't care. They would rather do what was right in their own eyes. And what happens in verse 11? And the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baalim. And Baalim is the Hebrew word for the Canaanite gods. Baal it simply means master. It simply means Lord or ruler. In fact, the word Baal is used to refer sometimes to human rulers, but generally it's referring to pagan Canaanite deities. So master, Lord, ruler, whatever. That's the basic idea of what Baal means. In fact, God is sometimes called Baal. It's just what the word means, master. Anyway, so Baal, and then Im is the Hebrew plural. In English, we have S as our plural. In Hebrew, Im is the plural. So Baalim means masters, other gods, other authorities. That's what that means right here. They served Baalim. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods, of the gods of the people that were round about them, and bowed themselves unto them, and provoked the Lord to anger. So this is the cycle of Judges. They knew God, they walked with God, they followed his commands, and God blessed them. And then they stopped they serve other gods, and God punishes them for it. He brings in other nations, other groups of people to oppress them. And as they do that, as Israel then falls to these oppressors, they cry out to God to save them, and God does so. He brings them judges, and the judge delivers them from the Canaanites. And the Canaanites, they are beat back, and then for the rest of that judge's life, he rules Israel. But then that judge passes away, and then Israel goes back into their sin that got them into that situation in the first place. And this happens over and over and over again. That is the entirety of the book of Judges. It is a cycle. Sin, oppression, they cry out to God, God delivers them, and then they are ruled by someone who God used to deliver them. But as you look through the lives of these judges, they are very, very imperfect men. Many of them aren't really named, or they're named, but they're not given many details as to what they did. About half of them, you don't really get details as to what they did. Some of them you do get details, and with the ones that you do get details for, a fair number of them are quite sinful men. Does God use horribly sinful men to bring about his desire? Absolutely. Does that make God sinful? No. But men are sinful. That is human nature. Some men are more sinful than others, but God can use anyone. God can use a Joseph, a Daniel, a Noah, who are righteous. Or he can also use Manasseh, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Samson, Ehud, Jephthah. We think of Jephthah, one of the judges. Do you guys remember what Jephthah did? He sacrificed his own daughter. Some people try to water this down or not dilute or water down, but they try to argue that it is less severe than a plain reading of the text suggests. They might suggest that instead of sacrificing his daughter on an altar, rather he devoted her to temple virginity. That's kind of what they try to say that is indicating he did instead of sacrificing her on an altar. Now, I'm not going to push one or the other. I do personally lean towards the actual sacrifice, but these are horrible men in many cases. But God uses whoever to accomplish his purpose. In fact, God used Pharaoh in the time of Exodus. God used Pharaoh to accomplish his purposes. He used Nebuchadnezzar to accomplish his purposes. So he uses anyone. He uses pagans. He uses believers. He uses fallen believers, someone who once believed or they do believe, but they are extremely imperfect and they do very terrible, sinful things. God uses anybody. So God uses whoever to accomplish his purposes. It is better if that person is godly, but God can use anyone. He will use anyone, regardless of their sinful state. They will be judged for their sins, but God will use anyone. So you have these judges. The first one is Othniel, and there's not much spoken of about him. Then you have Ehud, and that this one is kind of a favorite of 10-year-old boys. You guys remember Ehud, how Eglon was the king of Moab, and he was extremely fat. And you just get into these visceral details with the story, and 10-year-old boys love it. But Ehud, he comes to assassinate Eglon, and he's left-handed. The guards pat him down on the left side to check for a knife, and they don't find it, so they let him in. But because he's left-handed, he had the knife on the right side. You get into these details, and it's fun for the 10-year-old boys. But anyway, Ehud, he kills Eglon and continues on. Who is Eglon, who is the king of Moab, and he is oppressing Israel. But then Ehud kills Eglon, and then he rules over Israel for some time. In verse 30 of chapter 3, Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land had rest 80 years. So then you have more judges. You just have this cycle of judges: the sin, the oppression, the cry, the deliverance, and then the rule. So what is a judge? The Hebrew word for judge means, well, judge, but it also means a vindicator, a punisher. That is encompassed, those two ideas, vindication and punishing. Those are encompassed within the idea of a judge or a governor. So that's all encompassed. Judge, governor, vindicator, punisher. That's all encompassed in this word judge. And I kind of think of most of the time, rulers are not considered vindicators or punishers. You have kings, you have governors, you have emperors, you have presidents, you have prime ministers. All of these rulers, they will decide on the direction that their country goes. Now they have executive power to, of course, they have executive power to enforce the law, and they have agencies to do so. And this isn't just America. This isn't just modern countries. It's pretty much all countries. The ruler is the one who appoints sub-rulers. The Bible word for it would be governors or princes, but the sub-rulers, they are the ones appointed to enforce the law, because the king himself, he's only one guy. He can't personally go around the entire country enforcing the law. So he hires people to do that. And that's common all throughout. So most of the time, a ruler's job is simply to move the country forward, to grow the country, to make good decisions for the country. Generally, the job of a ruler is not to punish. That's part of the executive role of a king, of a ruler, but it's not his primary job, his primary role. However, the case with a judge in this time is that of vindicating, of punishing. The ruling kind of takes a backseat to the vindicating. So in a normal governing role, governing is primary, and then punishing is lesser. It's further down on the priority of this ruler's set of priorities. In this case, however, in the case of a judge, it's flipped. Punishing sin is the primary role, and ruling takes a back seat. So that flipping of the primary role will be the difference between a normal governor, prince, king, whatever, and a judge. Now, what is the occasion in which a judge arises? When law enforcement falls apart, when there is no real governance, when there is oppression, when there is, and many of those are causally related. One causes the other. Sin causes oppression, and oppression causes sin. It goes hand in hand. So when there is sin and oppression in a people group, the ruler cannot really move the country forward. First, he has to deal with the sin. First, he has to deal with the oppression that's going on. Now, what happens when the ruler is the one that's doing the oppression? Now the people are not ruled by someone for them, but rather against them. What happens then? What happens when the ruler is the one doing the oppression? Normally, a ruler should help people from the oppression, whatever oppression is coming to them. But what happens when the ruler is the one doing the oppression? The ruler is the one in charge of law enforcement. So what do the people have to resort to? They have to resort to restoring justice on their own terms, outside of law enforcement. In modern times, we have a word for that. What is it? vigilante? Are we seeing an increase in vigilantism in recent decades? Are vigilantes to some degree honorable? We cannot condone what they do because they are going outside of the rule of law. They are sidestepping law enforcement. So we cannot legally or morally condone what they're doing. But can we really condemn them when the law enforcement that's supposed to help them? For example, there's a famous case from, I believe, the 1990s where a man abuses a dad's daughter, young daughter, underage, and the father tries to get justice from this man, and it's just not happening. The sentence that the abuser is receiving is extremely light, and this is a failure of law enforcement. It's a failure of the justice system. And this father, distraught that the justice system is failing him, he shoots the man while he's in custody and kills him. That is morally wrong. That is outside of the rule of law. It is outside of the justice system. We cannot condone that. But can you understand it? Can you truly condemn him for taking into his own hands justice when the justice system failed him in such an egregious way? Without a common phrase I hear is without condoning or condemning, I understand. That's a phrase I hear a lot. And it's becoming more and more popular in current days where almost everyone agrees that the justice system is failing. It's falling apart. It's failing everyone. It is, for many intents and purposes, it is almost to the point of oppressing us, the common people, not just the right, not just the right wingers and conservatives, but left wingers believe that too. They have everyone on the lower end of the class spectrum, I guess you could say. Pretty much everyone in the lower class thinks that the justice system is against them, whether you're right wing or left wing. Pretty much everyone thinks that the justice system is failing greatly in some way. So, are we entering a time of judges? The justice system is failing us. Rulers are not doing what they are supposed to. We are experiencing oppression from various directions, and the rulers that are put in place to protect us from that oppression are not only failing in their job, but they are participating in the oppression. I believe we are entering a time of judges, and this is not something to look forward to. The time of judges was extremely fraught with violence and sin. We do not want to live in a time of judges, but I think we are going in that direction. What are some examples? I mentioned one already, the vigilante justice, people on their own going outside the justice system to carry out what they believe is proper justice. The idea of vigilante actually came from the Wild West. As people moved out to the American frontier during the 1800s, you didn't really have law enforcement. People would go out there, they would settle the West, they would start up little gold mining towns like Republic, and it would be just small towns, small groups of people just doing their thing, just trying to get gold, lumber, silver, whatever the Western rush was. So people are just rushing out to the West, and there's no law enforcement infrastructure. And so people being sinful, they do sinful things, and so those settlements had to deal with crime in some way. There was really no law infrastructure there, so they had to deal with it in their own way. And how did they do that? They came together in committees to watch for the safety of their town. So these committees of watchmen were called vigilantes. The vigilance committee is what it was called. And so back in that time, when there was no law enforcement, a vigilance community or a vigilance committee where people were given authority by the entire community to carry out law enforcement that was kind of parallel but not in line with Eastern laws. At that time, it was okay. But then in this time, as we have law enforcement pretty much everywhere, you cannot go outside the law. You do need to work within the law. So that sense of taking upon yourself justice outside of law enforcement has taken on that word of vigilance or vigilante. So now when people believe that the law enforcement is insufficient, they take justice into their own hands, and that's called vigilante. So, but that's kind of on the individual level. Let's go on to a broader national level. Are we seeing people in political positions taking on the oppression at the topmost level? I would say yes. Are such politicians exclusively on the right or left? No. Are they more common on the right? Maybe, but I would say there are a lot on the left that believe they are fighting oppression. Regardless, judges are coming around, but the wake of these judges, we think of the boats on the lake. As the boats are moving forward, they create waves going in both directions. That's called the wake. The wake of these politicians moving the way they are sometimes leads to extremism, sometimes leads to violence. And obviously you can't condone it, but can you see why the violence is occurring in light of these politicians who are rallying people under the idea that they are fighting oppression? If oppression is in place, what is left but to fight against it physically? And that is violence. If you believe that you are being oppressed and the systems in place to deal with that are failing, the common suggestion to go through the proper systems, the proper conduits to achieve justice, if you believe those conduits themselves are corrupt, what else is there? That is why you are seeing not just vigilante justice on an individual level, when you have crimes being committed and people taking the retribution for those crimes into their own hands, but also on a grander political and national level. Part of the reason you're seeing an increase in violence on both sides is because both sides believe that they are fighting oppression, and that the normal means, the normal conduits of achieving justice are corrupt to the core. Is this situation easily solvable? Absolutely not. It's not going to be solved anytime soon, probably going to get worse. But violence is a consequence of oppression existing. Whether from the right, from the left, it happened in the time of Judges. Deborah and Barak, you have Shamgar, you have Gideon. So, and some of these are more well-known names for us. We think of Gideon, who fought off the Canaanites by ambushing them in the night, and you had the trumpets and smashing the pots. So you had that. You had Deborah and Barak. You have these other judges. So we have in our own times what could be considered judges. we like to think of Trump as a sort of judge. We compare him to Samson, a very flawed individual, but doing his darndest to fight against the oppressors and smashing down the establishments in doing so. We think of Samson as he called out to God one last time to receive his strength, and he pushed the columns down, brought the entire building down on himself and the Philistines in there. So we like to think Trump is sort of a Samson-like figure. One humorous thing I noticed as I was studying for this lesson is I believe it was the 11th judge is named Elon. We have in our government system, or soon to be, Elon Musk. So that kind of made me chuckle a little bit as I was studying for this lesson. But in our current time, we are experiencing judges, and they are attempting at least to fight against the oppressors. Now, are we physically being oppressed? Are we enslaved? Are we forced out of our homes? Are we forced in various physical ways? Physically, no, we're not really being oppressed. Spiritually, mentally, it's hard to use the word oppression for physical or for spiritual, mental, and maybe political, I'd say. So political, spiritual, and mental disagreements on a broad cultural level that we disagree with. I can't really, in good conscience, call that oppression, but there are some smaller examples where I think oppression could be used, where freedom to gather, freedom of association, freedom to gather in public areas. You hear plenty of examples of Christians going to not necessarily the door, but the street, the block, the sidewalk where an abortion clinic is, and they just stand there praying. They encounter women going into it, and they try to talk to them a little bit. Though that should be a freedom to exist in a public place, but such people that do those things are being actually arrested for doing a legal thing. And I think some lawsuits have been taken in those cases, but it's still happening where Christians are being, in some small ways, it's not to the point of actual persecution yet, but in some small ways you can see it moving in that direction, where we are being denied freedom to exist in public places if we are objecting to the moral compass of current society. And so in small ways, we're starting to see actual persecution and actual oppression crop up. So it's not quite to that point yet. But we see it moving in that direction. So are we entering a time of judges? We're not quite to the point of being oppressed yet, but it's moving in that direction. Are we seeing politicians and individuals who are kind of acting as judges? I would say it's moving in that direction. Are we there yet? No. Are we moving in that direction? I think more and more so. What do we do about it? We seem to be entering a time of judges, and it's fun to tell these stories to 10-year-old boys. But is it fun to go through it? No. We need to pray to God for revival. We need to return as a nation to God. Freedom as a value is good. But we need to remember what John Adams said about freedom. freedom is only the kind of freedom that is given to us by our Constitution is only good for a moral and religious people and is insufficient for any other. We are losing our religion as a country. We are losing our morals. And as such, the freedom that we have is causing our society to spiral into hell. And as such, as the people do that which is right in their own eyes, we're going to experience sin and oppression at levels that we, as a Christian society, have not seen up to this point. We worry about it, we prophesy about it, and as it moves in that direction, we kind of have a grim, I told you so attitude towards it. We just need to continue to share the gospel because that's really all we can do. Politicians are not going to be our saviors. The judges, they would deliver Israel for a time, but then Israel would just go straight back to the sin that got them into that situation in the first place. The judges are not the solution. They are a Band-Aid. And oftentimes the judges themselves are worse, are extremely terrible people. They're not quite as bad as the oppressors. They're not as bad as the Philistines. They're not as bad as the Moabites, but they're still pretty bad in and of themselves. We see that in our current crop of reactionary and fighting against the system kind of right-wing politicians that we have. They're quite horrible people. Trump and Elon Musk are no role models, but they're at least a teeny bit better than the alternative. So politicians are not going to be our saviors. We need to spread the gospel, tell other people about Christ, and that is our responsibility. We can vote for things that we like. We can vote for biblical values if they happen to appear on a ballot. We can even propose such ballots. There's no prohibition on Christians becoming politicians and moving society in a more Christian direction, but that's not the prime goal. The prime goal, the prime directive of us Christians and the church in general is to share the gospel. And if that happens to coincide with a nation as a whole becoming Christian, becoming culturally Christian, that is all well and good, but that is not the purpose. That's not the goal. The goal is sharing Christ to individuals. And that's all I'll say for today. All right, let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, thanks for today. Thank you for bringing us to your house to listen to the kind of instruction that you give to your people and the stories that we read of the judges. And as we read the judges, we see that there are parallels to today, and it is not pleasant to think about. The kind of violence and sin and oppression that went on during the time of Judges is not desirable, and we should not want to go there or think it's good that we are experiencing the birth pangs of this kind of time. But if it is your will and it is your prerogative to bring judgment upon us, we can at least continue to be faithful in our duty to share the gospel with individuals, share the gospel on an individual level, on a social level, on a community level. However we get the gospel out, that is our prime duty. And many times that will be accompanied with persecution. And I thank you for being able to live in a country that up to this point has not persecuted Christians, but as it seems to be moving in that direction, I pray that we would remain faithful to share the gospel. In Jesus' name I pray, amen. We are dismissed.